What if the man who saved your life was the same man who was determined to give you away? Imagine a love so deep it chose silence over a confession, and a duke so frozen by duty that he would rather see the woman he loves at the altar with his brother than risk her being tethered to his own cold heart. This is the story of Adrien, the Ice Duke, and the day his carefully constructed walls finally began to scream. If this tale of hidden devotion moves you, please subscribe and leave a comment sharing your favorite historical era. I would love to hear which star-crossed lovers tropes you want to see explored in our next chapters. Chapter 1. The Ledger of a Frozen Heart. The weight of a dukedom does not rest in the gold of a signet ring or the velvet of a formal robe. It rests in the ink. For Adrien Thorne, the Duke of Ashworth, life was a series of columns, debts on the left, duties on the right, and a hollow space in the center where a soul was meant to reside. He sat in the library, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and the dying embers of a fire he hadn't bothered to stoke. At 29, he felt 100. He had inherited the title at 19, a boy suddenly burdened with the wreckage of his father's debauchery. He had spent a decade clawing the Ashworth name out of the mud of the London gutters, trading his youth for solvency and his laughter for a reputation of impenetrable ice. The Ice Duke, they whispered in the ballrooms. Adrien didn't mind. Ice was stable. Ice didn't gamble away the tenant cottages or leave a trail of broken mistresses and unpaid bills. He looked down at the ledger before him. It wasn't the estate accounts tonight. It was a private book, bound in simple calfskin. In it, he tracked the salvation of the Cavendish family. He had spent 3 years quietly buying up Catherine Cavendish's father's vowels, settling his gambling debts through anonymous solicitors, and ensuring that her family's home remained their own. And then he had committed his greatest sin. He had bought her a husband. He hadn't intended it that way, but when the Cavendish scandal broke, Catherine, vibrant, golden, spirited Catherine, would have been ruined. She needed a match that commanded respect. She needed someone who could provide the joy Adrien felt he had long ago forfeited. He thought of his younger brother, Oliver. Oliver, who was everything Adrien was not. Charming, quick with a joke, a man who moved through a room like sunlight on water. Adrien had paid the dowry himself, funneling the funds through Oliver's accounts so that Catherine would never know she had been saved by a man as grim as a tombstone. He let Oliver take the credit. He let Oliver be the hero. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Adrien, are you coming to the ballroom? The orchestra has begun the second set." It was Catherine. Her voice always had a way of cutting through his armor, a melodic frequency that made his very bones ache. He closed the ledger with a sharp thud. "In a moment, Catherine," he said, his voice a practiced, level baritone. She pushed the door open anyway. She was a vision in pale silk, her hair gathered in a constellation of pearls. She looked like the very spring he had denied himself. She stepped into the gloom of the library, her brow furrowing as she looked at his solitary figure. "You are hiding again," she said, her tone a mix of playfulness and a strange, sharp edge he couldn't quite place. "It is your brother's pre-wedding ball. You are the host. It is unseemly for the host to be courting a stack of papers while his guests are dancing." "The estate does not manage itself because of a party," Adrien replied, rising slowly. He kept the desk between them. "Oliver is doing enough dancing for the both of us, I am sure." "Oliver is charming everyone," she agreed, stepping closer. "But Oliver is not the Duke, and Oliver is not—" She trailed off, her eyes searching his. "Why do you never look at me, Adrien? Not truly." "I look at you constantly," he whispered, the truth slipping out before he could catch it. He corrected himself instantly. "I am responsible for your well-being. It is my duty to look after you." Duty. The word felt like ash in his mouth. "Is that all I am? A duty? A line in your ledger?" "You are to be my sister-in-law. You are family." She winced as if he had struck her.
For a moment, the mask of the Ice Duke felt dangerously thin. He wanted to reach across the mahogany, to take her face in his hands, and tell her that he had spent 10 years building a fortress just to keep her safe within it. He wanted to tell her that every penny he earned was for her, and every breath he took was heavy with the scent of her perfume. But he was a ghost of a man. He was the debt collector, the fixer, the man who had forgotten how to smile. She deserved the sunlight. She deserved Oliver. "The next dance is a waltz," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a low, daring challenge. "As the head of the house, you owe me at least 3 minutes of your time, unless you are afraid, Your Grace." "I am afraid of nothing," he lied.
He led her into the ballroom, the light of 1,000 candles blinding him after the darkness of the library. The music began, a sweeping, melancholic string arrangement that seemed to echo the very rhythm of his heart. He took her hand. It was small and warm, a stark contrast to his own cold palm. He placed his hand at her waist, and for a second, the world fell away. The gossiping dowagers, the clinking of champagne flutes, the heavy weight of the Ashworth name, it all vanished. He held her a fraction too tight. He couldn't help it. The desperation he had suppressed for years was leaking out through his fingertips. He could feel the heat of her through the silk of her gown. "You are trembling," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. They were wide, searching, filled with a desperation that mirrored his own, though he was too blinded by his own martyrdom to see it. "It is the heat of the room," he gritted out. "It is not," she countered. They spun, the colours of the ballroom blurring into a kaleidoscope of gold and white. "Why is it always Oliver who speaks, Adrien? Why is it Oliver who brings the flowers, and Oliver who makes the promises, while you only watch from the shadows? Do you hate me so much that you cannot even offer a kind word before I am wed?" The question was a dagger. He felt the crack in his chest, the ice splintering, the cold water of a decade's worth of repressed longing rushing in to drown him. "I could never hate you," he said, his voice raw, stripped of his ducal authority. "Tell me to stay," she breathed. The music was reaching its crescendo. "Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you don't want me to marry him."
Adrien looked across the room. He saw Oliver laughing with a group of friends, looking handsome and carefree. He saw the life he had built for Catherine, a life of security, of laughter, of a husband who wasn't haunted by the ghosts of a ruined father. If he spoke now, he would be a thief. He would be taking back the gift he had given her. He would be tethering her to a man who didn't know how to be happy. "I cannot," he choked out. The music stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the orchestra had ever been. Adrien dropped his hand as if burned. He didn't wait for the applause. He didn't look at her face, which he knew was etched with a heartbreak he had caused. He turned and walked out of the ballroom, through the foyer, and straight to the stables. "Your Grace," the groom asked, startled. "It is nearly midnight." "Saddle my horse," Adrien commanded, his voice shaking. "A single bag, now." He couldn't stay. If he stayed for the "I do," he would scream. He would ruin her. He would beg her to choose the dark over the light. He would ride for the coast, find a ship to the continent, and exile himself. He would let the Ice Duke finally melt away into nothingness, far from the woman who had finally broken him. He rode out into the night, the mud splashing his evening clothes, leaving behind the only thing he had ever truly loved. Chapter 2. The Mirror and the Mud. The morning of the wedding dawned not with a celebratory sun, but with a persistent grey drizzle that clung to the stone walls of Ashworth Manor like a shroud. Inside, the house was a hive of frantic activity. Florists lugged heavy urns of white lilies, maids hurried with pressed linens, and the smell of roasting game wafted from the kitchens. But in the centre of the storm, there was a vacuum. The Duke was gone. Oliver Thorne, the younger brother, stood in Adrien's private study. He was dressed in his wedding finery, a coat of midnight blue that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, but his face was pale, his hands trembling as he held a heavy ledger he had found tucked behind a row of dry legal tomes. Oliver had never been a man of business. He was the fun one, the one who spent his days at White's and his nights at the theatre. He had accepted the news of his engagement to Catherine with a mixture of delight and relief. He loved her, in his own bright, shallow way. He had assumed the sudden stabilization of the Cavendish finances was a stroke of luck, or perhaps a secret inheritance. He had happily stepped into the role of the saviour, basking in the gratitude of Catherine's father and the admiring glances of the Thorne. But the ledger in his hands told a different story. It was a meticulous record of every debt Adrien had paid, every property he had saved, and every sacrifice he had made to ensure Catherine's future was secure. And tucked between the pages were the letters. They were never sent. They were scrap after scrap of parchment, written in Adrien's sharp, disciplined hand, but the words were anything but disciplined. I saw you today in the garden, and for a moment the world was not a ledger to be balanced. To give you to him is to tear the heart from my chest, yet I would rather bleed in silence than see you want for anything. You are the light, Catherine, and I am the cold stone that must hold the torch.
Oliver felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who had been handed a life he hadn't earned. He looked at the date on the last letter. It was from the night before. Adrien hadn't gone to the continent for business. He had fled because he could no longer bear the weight of his own nobility. A soft rustle of silk at the door made him look up. Catherine stood there, already veiled, her face a mask of porcelain misery. "The carriage is waiting, Oliver," she said, her voice hollow. Oliver looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same hollowness. He saw the way her eyes darted toward the empty chair behind the desk, the way she flinched at the silence of the room. "He's gone, Catherine," Oliver said, his voice cracking. "Adrien left in the middle of the night." She didn't cry. She simply let out a long, shuddering breath, as if the last of her hope had finally evaporated. "I know. I think I drove him away. I asked too much of him at the ball." "No," Oliver said, stepping forward, the ledger heavy in his hands. "He bought your father's debts. He paid for your dowry. He's been in love with you since we were children, and he thought he was too cold for you. He thought I was the better choice." Catherine snatched the ledger, her eyes scanning the columns of figures and the jagged lines of poetry. Her breath hitched. He did all of this, quietly, while letting you take the praise." "I felt like a fraud, Catherine," Oliver admitted, his face flushing with shame. "I knew something wasn't right. And you, tell me the truth. Do you love me, or are you marrying me because you'd rather be his sister-in-law than a stranger?"
You think you're being noble. You think this is a sacrifice? It's not. It's cowardice, Adrien. You're stealing her life and mine because you're too afraid to believe that someone could love a man who worries about debts and roofs. "I am a ghost, Oliver," Adrien hissed, his voice trembling with a decade of suppressed rage. "I have nothing left to give her but a name and a crumbling estate. You can give her joy." "She doesn't want joy," Oliver yelled, gesturing wildly towards Catherine, who was standing a few feet away, the rain soaking into her white silk dress. "She wants you. She just told me she'd rather have your shadow than my son. Now you have two choices. You get back on that horse and you get to the altar, or I will throw this ledger into the Thames and tell the world that the great Ice Duke is actually just a man who's afraid of a girl in a white dress." Adrien looked at the ledger, then at his brother, and finally at Catherine. She was shivering, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks,
her eyes burning with a fire that could melt the very foundation of his frozen heart. "You would let me take your place?" Adrien whispered, his voice breaking. "It was never my place to begin with," Oliver said softly, his anger fading into a sad, knowing smile. "Go on. You've been the Duke for 10 years. For once in your life, Adrien, just be a man." The boat's whistle blew, a mournful sound in the fog. Adrien looked at the gangplank, then back at the woman who had haunted his every dream. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the reins of Oliver's horse, swung himself into the saddle, and reached down a hand for Catherine. "We have an hour until the ceremony," Adrien said, his eyes finally alive with a terrifying, beautiful light. "I suggest we don't keep the king waiting."
Chapter 3. The Altar of Truth. The interior of St. George's Cathedral was a cavern of gold leaf, ancient incense, and the suffocating pressure of expectation. Every pew was packed with the cream of the ton, a sea of silk hats and judging monocles. At the very front sat the king, a silent observer of the union between two of the most powerful houses in the realm. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, the scent of a funeral, Catherine thought, as she began her slow walk down the long stone aisle. Her face was hidden behind a heavy lace veil, which was fortunate, for her eyes were red-rimmed and her lips were trembling. She felt like a lamb being led to a very elegant slaughter. Beside her, her father beamed, oblivious to the fact that her daughter's heart had been left behind on a rain-slicked dock in the arms of a man who didn't want it. Then she saw him. The groom stood at the altar, his back to the congregation. He was not the polished golden figure of Oliver Thorne. His shoulders were broader, his stance more rigid, and even from the back there was a jagged energy radiating from him that made the air hum. As Catherine reached the altar, the figure turned. A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral, sharp as a physical blow. It was Adrien. He was a sight of utter scandal. His hair was windswept and damp, his cravat was discarded, and his boots were caked in the dark, heavy mud of the London outskirts. He looked nothing like a duke, and everything like a man who had stared into the abyss and decided to climb out. The bishop froze, his prayer book trembling. "Your Grace, where is Lord Oliver?" Adrien didn't look at the bishop, he didn't look at the king, he looked only at Catherine. He stepped forward, ignoring every rule of decorum that had governed his life for a decade.
"Stop the music," Adrien commanded. His voice wasn't the cold, level baritone of the Ice Duke. It was raw, cracked, and terrifyingly human. The orchestra trailed off into a confused silence. "Adrien, what are you doing?" her father hissed, but Adrien stepped between them, taking Catherine's gloved hands in his own mud-stained ones. "I have spent 10 years living for everyone but myself," Adrien said, his voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "I have balanced books, saved reputations, and played the part of the stoic protector until I became nothing but a shell of a man. I thought that by giving Catherine to my brother, I was giving her a life of light. I thought I was too broken, too cold to ever be the man she deserved." He turned slightly, addressing the shocked faces of the aristocracy. "I lied to you all. I arranged this marriage. I paid the debts. I tried to buy her happiness because I was too much of a coward to ask her to share my burdens." He looked back at Catherine, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I tried to give you the better brother, Catherine. But if you will have me, the cold one, the silent one, the one who will spend every day of his life trying to learn how to laugh again just to hear you join him, then I am here. I am not a duke today. I am just a man who loves you." The scandal was immediate. The whispers broke out like a storm. "Impropriety! The king is watching! Absolute madness!" But Catherine didn't hear them. She saw only the man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. She reached up, her fingers fumbling with the pins of her veil, until she ripped it away, letting the lace fall to the cold stone floor. Her face was radiant, wet with tears of a different kind. "You fool," she whispered, a smile breaking through her sobs. "I never wanted the light. I wanted the man who kept the fire burning." She didn't wait for the bishop's blessing or the king's approval. She threw her arms around Adrian's neck and kissed him, hard, desperate, and thoroughly scandalous, right there at the altar. The ice duke didn't just melt, he shattered. He pulled her against him with a ferocity that spoke of years of starved longing, his hands tangling in her hair as he claimed the life he had almost thrown away. 6 months later, the scandal of the altar rebellion had settled into the stuff of legends. The tons still talked, of course, but they did so with a touch of envy. At the Thorne estate, the heavy ledgers still existed, but they no longer sat in a dark, lonely library. The windows were thrown open to the summer air, and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls. Oliver had moved to a smaller villa on the coast, happily pursuing an opera singer with a voice like a nightingale and a reputation that made the dowagers saint, a life he found much more suited to his temperament. Adrien stood on the terrace, watching the clouds gather. He felt a hand slip into his, and he didn't even have to look to know it was Catherine.
"It's going to rain," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Adrien smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. "Let it. The gardens need it. You used to hate the rain," she teased. "You said it was messy and unpredictable." "I was a very boring man," he admitted, turning to pull her into his arms. He looked out over the land he had saved, the home he had built, and the woman who had saved him. The duty was still there, the responsibility of his title remained, but it was no longer a cage, it was simply the soil in which his love grew. As the first heavy drops began to fall, Adrien didn't head for the shelter of the house. Instead, he led his wife down the stone steps and into the grass. Under the darkening sky, the man once known as the Ice Duke began to dance, spinning his wife in the rain, finally understanding that the greatest duty of all was not to a name, but to the truth of the heart.